Disney CEO Bob Iger hasn't been having a particularly good time since his triumphant return as CEO and has been left feeling, quote, overwhelmed and exhausted. Overwhelmed and exhausted, that is, at the prospect of righting all the wrongs caused by his brief predecessor, Bob Chapek. Or at least that's what the New York Post has to say. That's the narrative, that this poor sucker Bob Chapek, who was said to be handpicked by Iger, was such a disastrous CEO that Bob #1 just had to come back. He had to save the day. But who could blame him? He had an incredibly successful run as Disney CEO and couldn't bear to watch Chapek throw it all away. Because, that's totally what happened. But we'll get to that. And like Brett Favre in the early 2000s, the man just couldn't retire. He only said he would half a dozen times, and then, didn't. But here we are now. Just look at all these rage bait Disney videos on YouTube. And that's okay. Rage bait is a good thing. It's usually founded in legitimate frustration, which is how a lot of people are feeling about Disney at the moment. Legitimately frustrated. As Iger said in his interview with CNBC, there have been a lot of creative misses lately at the company.
And I think you'd have to agree that there were some creative misses as well.
To put it lightly, of course. And to put it not so lightly, a streaming service that cannot turn a profit, agenda-fueled content, beef with Florida, and Elon Musk telling you to go F yourself. Bob's got a lot on his plate, and he is not taking it in stride. If only there was someone else who could take the fall for his mistakes. Oh wait, they already tried that. Join me this week as I take a closer look at Bob Iger's recent years at Disney and how a long and fruitful career is beginning to go down in flames. According to Wall Street Journal reporter Robbie Whelan, Bob Iger by some estimates is, quote, the best media executive in history, the most successful and near the top of the list for American CEOs in general terms, of what he did with Disney between 2005 and 2020, end quote. So it comes as no surprise that in 2022, many in the business and media world were pretty ecstatic when Iger said he would be returning to the role of CEO after Chapek was ousted. But was it really Chapek's mess? Or was it the world's? He was appointed CEO in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. He was ousted in 2022 as the pandemic was coming to a close. I mean, if we're being totally honest, Bob Chapek was never really the CEO of Disney in the first place. I mean, he was in name, but as part of Iger's succession plan, he was allowed to stay on as an executive chairman for 22 more months. Chapek was supposed to be moving into Iger's expansive office at Disney headquarters in Burbank, California. However, since Iger had no plans to leave, Chapek moved into a smaller office on the same floor of the building, and Iger kept his. Chapek would report directly to Bob Iger and the board. Iger would also continue to, quote, direct the company's creative endeavors, end quote. So basically, he would maintain creative control of the movie and TV content operations. So, do with that information what you will. Draw whatever conclusions you like. Many have said that in Iger's return to the office of CEO, he's, quote, lost his magic. I would tend to believe that he never really left the office in the first place. Literally and figuratively, given that Iger kept his office in Burbank that had previously belonged to Michael Eisner. But there is something to be said to the notion of Iger losing his touch. Obviously, what Iger did between 2005 and 2020 was huge for the company. Namely, he made a deal to acquire Pixar in 2006, bought Marvel in 2009, bought Lucasfilm, namely Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and a few other properties they owned in 2012, and acquired most of 21st Century Fox in 2019. And if this sounds like an attempt by Disney to damn near monopolize entertainment, that's because that's exactly what it is. There are 5 major film studios in Hollywood. 5. Universal, Paramount, Warner Bros., Walt Disney, and Sony. There were 6, but Fox is Disney now, so there you go. From a moral perspective, I'm sure you could make an argument that this isn't necessarily a good thing. It's bad for small independent studios. It's so rare to see a film nowadays that costs less than $200 million coming out of any of these 5 studios. It seems almost unfair that they hold all the power. But that's not the purpose of this video. This video is for Bob. And Bob, the businessman, probably had a pretty big skip in his step after making all these deals, because he was making bank. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is the highest grossing film franchise of all time, $30 billion. Star Wars is the second highest, now also owned by Disney, and that's at $10 billion. So it's not even a competition, really. I mean, the MCU blows all of them out of the water. It's basically gone to crap ever since Endgame, and it still cannot be denied that this was the greatest business decision of Iger's career. They could make 20 new MCU films starting now, all utter garbage, not one of them turning a profit, and it would still be the greatest business decision of his career. I, for one, am happy to see the MCU going away. As much as I loved those films at first, the quality has taken a serious dip. Creativity is lacking, social and political messaging is everywhere, and fans are losing interest. A Marvel film is far from guaranteed to turn a profit anymore, and with film and ticket sales down almost 50% since COVID and showing no signs of recovering, Disney's going to need a new plan to turn this one around. If you want to know more about that topic, I highly recommend this video here, where I dive far deeper into what's happened at Marvel. But anyhow, the MCU, $30 billion, Star Wars, $10 billion. Disney paid $4 billion to acquire Marvel and another $4 billion to acquire Lucasfilm. So safe to say that these were good investments. So Bob's early career as CEO of Disney was certainly high caliber, but things have began to change in recent years. He's become the target for a lot of criticism. Disney has become the target for a lot of criticism. So while Bob Chapek was pretty obviously, in my opinion, a fall guy, there's no one left to take the heat for Disney's, quote, creative misses, and various other shenanigans that we'll get into shortly. And recently, as stated earlier, Iger did address a number of creative misses that the studio had in recent years, along with concerns for their content business. And many of these misses happened on Disney+, Disney's not-so-successful streaming service. So Disney Plus is actually the second most subscribed streaming service out there. Possibly third, Prime is up there, but I never really trust anything Amazon says, so second or third, whatever. As far as streaming services go, it's doing well. But that's as far as streaming services go. See, no streaming service is doing particularly well right now. I mean, they're mostly ad-free, they're cheaper than cable, but the problem is they're mostly ad-free and cheaper than cable. See, it's been estimated that streaming generates 1/6 as much revenue per home as cable TV, ad revenue. And while some streaming services such as Peacock and others run a couple ads that run for 1-minute intervals during episodes of whatever show, they offer a slightly higher dollar subscription to turn these ads off, therefore offering less reach to advertisers and therefore lowering the ad revenue received from these advertising companies. Now, most streaming services have jumped on the show ads bandwagon, and this will only continue to get worse in years to come, but I'll get to that later. All of this aside, Disney Plus hasn't turned a profit since it came online. To be fair, executives at the company did claim that they never expected to make a profit on the streaming platform until 2024. But so far, it's managed to lose billions. Reasons for this include, but are not limited to, paying hundreds of millions of dollars to produce original content for the platform, such as those Marvel TV shows that everybody just loved so much. Yeah, those were about $200 million a pop. But what was the box office, you might ask? Well, there is none, because it's a show on a streaming platform and there is virtually no way to quantify how much revenue the show's brought in. But apparently not enough to turn a profit. Anyway, this last quarter, Disney Plus lost $387 million. Now that's a major improvement to the same time last year, which saw them losing $1.4 billion on the platform. And let's not forget about the $172 billion in market value the company has lost since 2020. Just felt the need to throw that little tidbit in there. So, streaming. It seems more and more streaming services are popping up out of nowhere these days. Well, of course, it's the new way to watch TV. But the idea is seemingly that with the rise of bigger streaming services such as Disney Plus, the smaller, lesser subscribed ones such as Peacock, Apple TV, even Paramount Plus might just start to fizzle out of existence, leaving only a few to rake in all the subs and rake in all the money. However, that is not what's happening, at least not yet anyways. First of all, those three I just listed are actually still top 10. They are at the lower end of the top 10, but top 10 nonetheless. You would not believe how many streaming services there really are. It's worth a Google. And it would appear that these smaller services hanging in there are increasing competition, and Disney's attempts at monopolizing Hollywood and buying every IP left are falling flat. See, streaming services like to get their hands on really popular IPs, and then they double down on them to drive subscriptions. Paramount Plus has Star Trek, Max has DC, Amazon had or has Lord of the Rings. With Warner Bros. Announcing a reboot, I don't really know what's going on there. And Disney Plus has Star Wars and Marvel. While there is still a ton of other content on Disney Plus, they really double down on these particular IPs to drive subscriptions to the platform. But this comes with its own slew of issues. Motivated by money and money alone, Disney has been vomiting out show after show after show in terms of those big IPs. All the Marvel shows, all the Star Wars shows. For the love of God, don't unsubscribe or you'll miss the next big show. And they have 8 or so short episodes released once a week so that they can keep you subscribed for 2 to 3 months. With the speed at which these shows are being released, quality tends to wane. And for plenty of other reasons, but not the point. With the waning quality of these sorts of shows, diehard fans get angry and unsubscribe. But this affects casual fans as well, because casual fans are probably more than happy to make an account, watch the show or movie they wanted to watch, then peace out for the next 8 months, until they hear something interesting is coming out and maybe return for another 2 months or so. This is a big contributing factor to why the streaming service model doesn't work. It's too easy to bail, which for us is a good thing, but not for the likes of Disney. And sorry to say, we should expect changes in coming years to this model. It just isn't profitable enough for these big companies, and investors realize that. But with all these streaming services clinging on for dear life, none of them want to be the first to break and just start running full-blown 5-minute ad segments right in the middle of their shows and films. That would lose subscribers, but something's gotta give. We're probably gonna end up with something like Fubo being top dog, a live TV streaming service that is ad-supported, films on demand, and doesn't produce its own highly costly original content. You know, like cable, with a little more convenience. So in terms of this video, and keeping with the theme, the point would be that Disney Plus hasn't really done Disney any favors. But in the broader scheme of things, streaming as a whole is not a very profitable business model, and certainly is not the future of TV. But since Bob is the focus of this video, and all the shenanigans he's been dealing with lately, I can't ignore what happened with Florida. I mean, Disney basically, albeit briefly, went to war with the state of Florida and objectively lost. If you haven't heard, feel free to click away and look into it, because I'm not going to get into all of that here. But basically, Disney went to battle with a certain Florida governor over a certain Florida bill, and long story short, they lost. See, when other Bob Chapek, was supposedly in charge, he attempted to stay out of it, and then the mob got involved. And Mr. Iger loves pandering to the mob. So according to Governor of Florida Ron DeSantis, in his new book, there was a private conversation between him and Chapek while the whole thing was going down. Chapek was trying to stay out of it, but faced tremendous pressure to weigh in. That story could be completely made up, so take it for what it is, but Chapek did initially attempt to stay out of the way. But after facing tremendous pressure, he eventually publicly denounced the bill, which led to protests and such at the Disney parks. So, how did this little conflict end? Well, Disney's park in Orlando sits on roughly 25,000 acres of land, and within their park they had their own autonomy, almost like their own little self-governing, governments in a number of these districts. And these districts lost their special tax exempt status on a number of amenities and services provided in those districts. In short, Disney will now owe an additional $200 million per year in state taxes. It was basically a lose-lose for Mr. Chapek, because either way, one side would have looked at him one way and one side of him the other way. Doesn't matter. The fact that they got involved at all is ludicrous. Some social justice warrior gets the idea that Disney ought to be weighing in on this issue that has absolutely nothing to do with them, spoke it into existence, and poof, $200 million down the toilet. Bet shareholders were happy about that one, and I have an inkling that if Chapek had been acting alone on this one, likely nothing would have ever came of it. Again, just an inkling. But when trying to please the mob, nobody wins. That's how that goes. But I can't help but wonder if attempts to please the mob contributed to the inevitable downfall of the creative side of Disney. And by the way, I'm just saying that because it sounds nice. Of course it contributed. Modern reimaginings galore at Disney at the moment, and creatively bankrupt superhero content that tries harder to push some message rather than entertain. It's worth going back and re-watching some of the first MCU films. You'll find many of them aren't as great as you remember, but they're certainly better than what's happening now. If you look at the creatives involved in the making of a lot of the Marvel shows on Disney Plus, or even many of the recent films, you'll find that many of these creatives lack credits. They lack experience, have maybe only worked on one or two other projects, many of which not even adjacent to the genre that Marvel's pulling them into. They are under-tested and underdeveloped in their trade. And that's what it is, a trade. Writing is a skill, directing is a skill that takes time and experience to develop. But Disney doesn't want skilled tradesmen working on their productions, they want somebody they can control. Executives have become the new creatives in this industry. They've established a system where executives run the show, and the creatives they hire, such as directors and writers, have to adhere to certain criteria when they sign on to work on a project. We know this based on what we saw with Edgar Wright leaving the original Ant-Man production or Scott Derrickson leaving Doctor Strange 2. Quote, creative differences with the studio. That's what they like to say, right? That they had creative differences. But studio executives aren't creatives, they're businessmen and women. It's not their job to be creative or even be super involved in the making of these shows and films. I'm usually not a fan of The Hollywood Reporter, but this problem has become so prevalent that even they are reporting on it. Quote, the company eschewed the traditional TV making model. It didn't commission pilots, but instead shot entire $150 million plus seasons of TV on the fly. It didn't hire showrunners, but instead depended on film executives to run its series. And as Marvel does for its movies, it relied on post-production and reshoots to fix what wasn't working, end quote. The wrong people are being given creative power, and this is the result, a creatively bankrupt company. Every show or film costs hundreds of $millions to make because the creatives don't have any idea how to manage a budget. They don't have any idea how to play the role they've been cast in. They need real writers, real directors, tradesmen. But no one with any real talent wants to do the work because Disney hijacks the entire creative process. Disney's fundamental misunderstanding of the creative process puts people in positions that aren't suited to their skill set, if they even have a skill set. As an example, there was a time when CGI couldn't be used as a crutch. Directors had to come up with creative ways to actually put what they wanted shown in front of the camera. When talking about this particular topic, I like to bring up Peter Jackson in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Jackson was given less than $300 million to work on those 3 films. Adjusted for inflation, that's $453 million today. Basing it off of the extended editions, we're talking about 10 hours of film, quite possibly the greatest film trilogy of all time, at under $300 million. It's not particularly shocking for a single Marvel movie to top the $300 million budget mark, and practically all of them now are over 200. Anyways, Jackson and his crew had to innovate to make that movie happen. He had to direct. They had to build things, make Arwen look like she's riding a horse up close even though she's just really in a wooden box rocking back and forth. Hire thousands of extras for an army, build a small-scale model of Minas Tirith and have a little camera moving through the streets. Very little CGI assistance, something you barely see anymore. Why did Minas Tirith look so real as the camera flew above the city when Gandalf rode into Gondor? Because it was. They actually built it. As creatives work their way up in the industry, they learn these sorts of things. The tricks of the trade, the ways they can cut costs and make something look good without spending millions of dollars on CGI contracts. They meet people who know how to build scale models and work in special effects. Fight choreographers, so that instead of having to make an actor look like they're fighting, they can show them how to do it. It's these sorts of skills that make experienced Hollywood writers and directors invaluable, especially when it comes to projects with huge budgets like Marvel. It's not enough to just be creative, you need to know how to do your job. They hire a no-name, someone they can control, to direct or write or just work on a project. Someone who's so grateful for the opportunity that they'll do whatever the studio wants. They give them all the money in the world, thinking that they just need the tools to make it happen, without realizing that these creatives lack the skill, talent, and experience to create something great. No amount of money can change that. These underexperienced creatives rely on CGI to make their vision become reality because they never learned how to do it themselves without using it as a crutch. And as more and more of these under-tested creatives are brought into the space, the more Hollywood loses that skill it used to have. There are so few highly skilled creatives left in Hollywood to work on these big budget films because Disney doesn't want to hire somebody with creative integrity. They want someone who will do what they want and you'll never see Christopher Nolan directing a Marvel movie for this exact reason. Someone like that won't sacrifice their creative integrity and creative freedom. So the mistakes, especially in recent years, are many. Since the triumphant return of Mr. Iger, just as many. But the biggest mistake Disney made was catering to a mob of people who might be louder than the rest, but certainly don't make up the majority. Disney picked a side, and they leaned hard to that side. They tried to cater to everyone, but inevitably cater to no one. You gotta know your audience, who watches what. By trying to make Star Wars for everybody, instead of just catering to the fans they already had, they lost their fans. By trying to make superhero films more about message and less about story, they lost those fans too. The approach to content in recent years has been laughable. It failed before it could even get off the ground because it never stood a chance to begin with. I would argue that projects like The Marvels would never be approved if it was pitched today. Who's that movie for? Who wants to go see it? Who's the audience? Well, years ago, it didn't matter who the audience was. Disney was mandated to be more inclusive with their films, and by golly, they did it. But at the cost of what? Creativity? It's not like you can't make a superhero film with a good female lead. You can, and it's been done many, many times. But it wasn't about telling a good story for Disney. It was about making what needs to be made so we look virtuous. And what's the result? Well, this. And a couple $100 million down the drain. And that's just one example of many. Disney likely realized the mob wasn't as big as they thought it was as they watched their stock price plummet, ticket sales fall off hard, extremely negative reactions to a franchise that was once nearly beloved by all. The fact is, ticket sales are down everywhere, and that's not changing anytime soon. Streaming isn't profitable, practically at all. Opinions can be opinions. There doesn't always have to be a definitive right and wrong on every issue. And a company like Disney is certainly not in authority to weigh in on issues like that to begin with. How about this? Less social and political messaging and more adventure, more fun, more wonder. Less ideology and more creativity. I really like making these and I'd like to keep making them, so please subscribe and like the video. If you love this sort of content, consider becoming a member. See you in the next one.